Thank you for joining us for this interview on the topic of COVID-19 impact on financial reporting. I'm KC from W Consulting, and I'll be speaking to Bridget, my colleague, my fellow IFRS advisor. Thanks, Bridget, for sharing your thoughts today. So let's just get straight into it. The first question would be, with COVID-19, obviously there's a lot of, if you go on the internet, there's plenty of resources, audit firms and so on that are publishing ideas as to the impact of financial reporting. What resources would you say you found most useful that are available?
So I think most of us are aware that the APC, SACA has made available on their website. There is some educational material documents which they have made available. And that was, if we consider who was involved in putting those documents together, there were representatives from the big firms, from some listed entities, regulators, etc. So I have actually found those documents to be quite useful. Those documents do, however, more just point out a potential issue or things to look out for. They don't necessarily give you the actual answer or the solution or what it is that you perhaps need to be doing, or the exact examples of what information needs to be disclosed in your financial statements. But I do feel that they're quite a good place to look at to try and see, is there something else that I should perhaps be considering in light of COVID and any potential impacts that it may have on me from a financial reporting perspective. The likes of the big four firms, they have also had various publications and documents which they have made available, which are easily accessible online. So I do find that I have actually, let's say, split my time quite evenly across doing some research across perhaps looking at the big four. The JSE has also just let out some documents, saying what is the type of disclosures that they'd be looking for. But I do see that there's a lot of similarity in the information that is currently available. Yeah. And a lot of it I feel is thought-provoking, not necessarily giving solutions and giving answers. And I think that to the extent that you may be a preparer of financial statements, you may still find yourself in a very cloudy gray area because you may be aware of the things to look out for, but not necessarily 100% sure what it is that you should be doing.
Okay. And in the local context, if you look at, I don't know if you've had a chance to review financial statements, what are you seeing in terms of what preparers have done, particularly at the, with the JSE financial statements, for instance?
So interestingly, I actually have spent, not just actually doing reviews from a quality review perspective, have actually been involved in the reviews of some interims as well as some year-end financial statements. But also I did a bit of research in going through the JSE by looking at the listed entities and their reporting period year ends and whether or not they have released their interim or if they've released their year-end results. We do just need to be aware of the fact that the JSE has granted an extension period. So what has actually transpired is that there's a lot of, I think, listed entity preparers who have not yet actually released their results because they are taking advantage of that, that extension period which has been granted to them. So their access, let's say, to information is a little bit restricted, but I guess over the next couple of weeks or the couple of months, there will be some more listed entity financial statements which will be available for review. What I have noticed, though, however, from the sets that I have looked at, is I do feel like you almost need to be raising the question to say to management, you haven't disclosed enough, or you're not putting enough detail in your financial statements. And I don't know if it's a case of everyone is a bit worried or scared. They don't really know what they should be doing or should have done, and therefore they don't know what they need to disclose. So perhaps it's a case of waiting to perhaps see what somebody else does, and then maybe we can copy that. But I've been quite surprised, let's say, at the thin disclosures that I have seen in financial statements. I think there's been one client's financials who I can say they did go into quite extensive disclosure. They were in the banking sector. So maybe that's also the reason why, given the industry that they are in, and if you think about impairment models, they expect a credit loss model, etc., from a financial instrument perspective, they were perhaps the only one client I can say who I did feel that management had clearly applied their minds in working out how to deal with COVID, what is the impact, and also what disclosures to put in their financials. But on the whole, I found that the disclosures are a little bit lacking.
Okay. And I think one disclosure that would be quite, one that management would have to think quite about is the timing, because if you look at the South African context, when did COVID really impact our businesses? And then is it a question of whether or not it's a subsequent event, or is it an event that impacted at financial year end? What are you seeing in terms of that, and what does educational material speak to this?
Okay, so I think, yes, obviously it's relevant to consider what a company's reporting period is, what the year end is, and also the timeline of events. And obviously, depending on the jurisdiction you're in, the timeline of events may be different. But looking from a local South African perspective, the World Health Organization announced it as a global pandemic. I think it was in mid-March. Locally, the lockdown was announced, I think, on the 23rd of March. The lockdown was effective on the 26th of March. So if you're looking at a company whose year end is before those dates, so let's say end of Feb, end of Jan, end of December 2019, I think would be comfortable to say that COVID is in those instances a post-balance sheet date event. And then obviously what those preparers need to just be cognizant of is those disclosure requirements of IAS 10. So it doesn't mean that because, the pandemic was announced or lockdown was effective, etc., after the year end, that it means that they get away scot-free, that it doesn't have any impact on them. IAS 10 still requires that where there are post-balance sheet date events, that there's still certain disclosures which need to be included in your financials. So detailing, what is it that's taken place, and to the extent that you can estimate or that you can quantify what the potential impact is, you should be disclosing that in your financial statements. So I feel that even those entities whose year ends are perhaps prior to the end of March, there is still an extensive amount of work which management should have gone through in actually working out and determining what are the appropriate disclosures from an IAS 10 perspective, even though we're saying it's a non-adjusting event. For entities whose year end is the 31st of March or thereafter, this is going to be an adjusting event in accordance with IAS 10, because the conditions existed at the 31st of March. Yes, we appreciate there's been some changes in the levels of lockdown, interest rate changes, etc. Some of those might have come into effect subsequent to your year end. So yes, those might then themselves be considered to be non-adjusting. But the reality is the pandemic was there. It had been announced, lockdown was already effective, etc., before 31st of March 2020. So therefore, at a minimum, if you've got a 31 March year end, this is an adjusting event for you, which means that your numbers as at the 31st of March need to be updated for the effects of COVID. So if you've got impairment valuations, determining your recoverable amount, fair value measurements, expected credit loss measurements in accordance with IFRS 9, all of those, let's say, cases where there's been forecasting, taking into account what you think budgets, forecasts, cash flows are going to look like, those should have all then been updated, to take into account the potential effects from the virus and the lockdown, which those, the impact that it may have had on the business.
Yeah. Look, we don't have an accounting standard on COVID. Obviously, you've mentioned quite a number. So I'm supposing there'll be a lot of judgments that are going to be required to be made by management. Beyond, if a standard, for instance, does not require disclosure of judgments, is there a need to disclose what management's thought processes and judgments are?
So we need to remember that IAS 1 is that IFRS standard, which gives us the general requirements for preparing and presenting our financial statements. And within IAS 1 itself, there is a general disclosure requirement that where there has been significant judgment applied by management, or where there are areas of estimation uncertainty, it is necessary for those actual judgments to be disclosed, and the actual inputs and the assumptions which may have been utilized by management in doing those estimates, those also need to be disclosed. So it's not sufficient, and it wouldn't be compliant with IAS 1 to just state that management applied judgment in doing an impairment assessment. It would be necessary to actually disclose what judgments did management apply. So there is that general requirement from an IAS 1 perspective. So even should a standard not specifically make reference or require judgments to be disclosed, we need to fall back on that general disclosure requirement from an IAS 1 perspective.
Great. Thanks, Bridget, for those thoughts on financial reporting on COVID-19. Obviously, we're going to have a few more discussions such as these, and if there's anyone who's got any, would like to contact Bridget to assist with any IFRS advice or training, Bridget at wconsulting.co.za. I believe that's your email.
Perfect.
Yeah, you can send your emails through there. Thanks, Bridget.
Pleasure. Thank you. you.